You can't expose what you know without exposing your vulnerabilities. And you can't expose what you know without exposing what you don't know. Dr. Hynek, here's the guy that worked in an official capacity for the United States Air Force from 47 to 69, whose job it was to provide prosaic explanations for the phenomenon when clearly a lot of times there wasn't one. Just a week prior, this was April 24th, 1964, Dr. Jacques Vallée, was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio with Dr. Hynek. And he was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with him. 2 days later, he gets the call. There's a landing at Socorro, New Mexico with a police officer, Lana Zamora. And there were military guys on the scene within an hour. There were physical trace cases on the ground. There were footprints from the creatures. There were smoldering bushes from the propulsion. There were massive imprints to determine the weight and the diameter of the landing gear. That is the most well-documented close encounter of the third kind in U.S. history. Edgar Mitchell was a proponent for government transparency. He a firm believer that we were being visited, firm believer that Roswell happened the way they initially announced it happening, an alien spaceship crashed. There's something going on. There doesn't appear to be a terrestrial explanation. Let's look into this further and let's encourage government transparency. Getting the interview with Senator Harry Reid was a miracle. It took several months of negotiations, and there was a very narrow window.
The answer is yes, and that's all this was about, and why the federal government all these years has covered up, put brake pads on everything.
So here's where we are today. We know through Elizondo and the likes of Mellon and Senator Reid and a handful of others, there's lots of evidence, photographic evidence, that has not been released. As some of the evidence, I've even spoken to the people that have seen it. A very, very large triangular-shaped UFO that came out of the ocean and went straight up to space, just. So there were 2 landing cases that I cover in the film at schools. One of them happened thanks to Paula Harris, who turned me on to this gentleman, James Rigney, in 1966 at Westall, which is a suburb of Melbourne, that a landing could occur at a school with hundreds of witnesses in broad daylight. So I always kind of was a little bit suspicious about these things, but I went to Australia and I met the witnesses. I went to the landing site, and that Westall 1966 UFO landing case is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, it was about right around morning recess, about 10 a.m. Ironically, in the United States, it was, I think, April 4th. With the time difference, there were congressional hearings that we covered in 1966 with Dr. Hynek, Secretary of the Air Force. This is all happening. And as those hearings were coming to an end and they were walking out of the halls of Congress, UFOs landing at a school in 10 o'clock in the morning, 10:30, something like this. And there were literally, according to the science teacher who I interviewed and all the witnesses, 300 plus witnesses standing outside in broad daylight, watching this craft maneuver. And then it goes and lands outside of the school playgrounds, but in a part of the area where the children would run track. And so a bunch of kids jumped the fence, sitting on the ground. They got within 10, 12 feet of it. It goes up off the ground like this, and then it turns this way, and then rockets out of sight. Now, the interesting thing about this case is that there was a gentleman 2 days earlier, and you'll know when you look into UFO accounts, there's usually a wave, there's usually a sighting period of several days prior and after that you'll get reports of the same craft. Well, there's a gentleman who lived about 12 to 17 kilometers away who took a photograph of it, and he described it exactly the same way, that it kind of floated down like this, and then right before it took off, it pivoted straight up and down and then went and shot off at like it was said, like a gun leaving the barrel, like a bullet leaving the barrel of a gun. So I would just like to see more government transparency, more front page news articles releasing evidence, releasing the existence of these programs for the general public around the world, because I think that every man, woman, and child is entitled to this story.
The question is no longer if they are here, but why.